All right. Better late than never, as I say. I do apologize.
All right. All right. I'm not. Hmm, I'm not getting anything here. Hold on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
I'm not. All right. There we go. All right. I'm ready when you are.
Okay, perfect. So, my sincere apologies to everyone for
Two
the
minutes.
delay. We've been having some technical issues here, and it's the nature of technology. Technology is such a funny thing. I mean, I'm not going to go on and on about this, but with these supposedly seamless technologies, they're supposed to not. We're not even supposed to notice them, but when things go wrong, then it's really noticeable. The materiality of these things is quite inescapable. But that being said, I want to welcome our really esteemed guest today, Professor David Bentley Hart. For those of you who may not be aware, and I hope that more of you are aware than not, Professor Hart is an American philosopher and Orthodox theologian whose work encompasses a wide range of subjects and genres. He is a prolific essayist and has written on topics as diverse as art, literature, religion, philosophy, film, baseball, and politics. He is also an author of fiction. And I'm sort of reading from the Wikipedia page here, and I'm not going to go on and on reading from Wikipedia, but I wanted to mention that in one of the descriptions from Wikipedia, it sort of describes your writing as being pyrotechnic. And I'm sure you don't care so much for Wikipedia's descriptions, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about, and we're going to be primarily focusing today on your really miraculous work. I mean, I think masterpiece is too weak a term, genuinely, and we can talk about the question of
Really, masterpiece falls far short of the reality.
well, it's inspired by your dog, so I mean, credit goes to Roland, I suppose.
Yes,
But,
yes.
but we can talk about the nature of inspiration, the nature of creativity, and things like that in a moment. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about your creative process, just a little bit for those of us who are aspiring writers and thinkers and philosophers.
Well, look, I should point out that by inclination, actually, I think of myself as a writer before anything else, and if I had my druthers, I'd write mostly fiction. It's just that the sort of fiction I write doesn't make you a lot of money. People say nice things about it, but I've been living by writing. So I have to admit that no matter what I'm doing, even if it's an essay on some very tedious topic of ontology or some obscure aspect of the history of Christian doctrine or Buddhist metaphysics or whatever, I tend to think in terms of the form first. Can I come up with a sufficiently disorienting opening sentence that no one can guess what point I'm planning to make until, maybe 2/3 of the way through the essay? And then can the conclusion seem satisfyingly to tie everything up, even if it's only an illusion? I have to, these are the sort of things that the discipline of actually, say, making a continuous argument is something I have to make myself obey. What really concerns me, I have to admit, first of all, is the aesthetic effect. I suppose that's what the pyrotechnic line is. You can get away with a lot, though, once you have a reputation. There were things, early on in my career, people said, "What strange mannerisms, and why does he lay now?" Now, I can do absolutely outrageous things, and no one, it never raises an eyebrow. So once you've established
Famous
yourself,
first. So the
or,
keys to become famous first.
yeah, once you've established yourself and even established your eccentricities as somehow strengths or virtues, you can get people to buy the Brooklyn Bridge from you. It's wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for that.
I have nothing else. The creative process. I mean, I don't know what else to say. I would say that make sure you know what your own sensibility, what your own tastes are, because otherwise, early on, and I say this to Esme because she's young and she's a writer, apparently, don't let editors try to make you sound like everybody else.
Yes. Yes.
This is the disease, especially in journalism, modern journalism, and in America it's worse than anywhere else, because there are a lot of editors who use the Chicago Manual of Style as their catechism. Simply the second worst manual of style ever written. The first being Strunk and White's Elements of Style. So anyway, that's my only advice on these things.
Well, that's incredible. Thank you so much. There's this quote from Bowie gave countless interviews, and I remember him sort of mentioning on the question of productivity and of course in this case musical production, he sort of said don't something to the effect of don't perform or make music for those in the audience, as it were. To primarily, and I don't know to what extent we can actually abide by this, like live by this, that to write or produce music or one's creative endeavor, first and foremost being for oneself. But then, I mean, there is the challenging, and we're always writing for an audience in mind as well. So it's something of a challenge.
I don't know if we are. I think that advice, it sounds like a sort of egoism or even selfish advice, but it's not. Because if you allow there to be any sort of estrangement between your natural critical faculties and the creative impulse, if you feel you have to obey a canon of rules that nonetheless does not agree with your own sensibility, you'll end up producing something not only worse in your own perspective, but in general, your readers won't like it as much. It turns out that it's very hard to write well, to compose music well, to do anything well without first and foremost pleasing yourself and letting yourself become absorbed in the act of writing or painting or composing. Because if it can draw you in, if the creative act can also be an act of delectation or appreciation, then you generally know you're writing well, unless you're just naturally a bad writer, and then what can be done. But if you have the talent, then trust your own temperament, and even if it's very far outside the mainstream.
I remember hearing, not to go on and on about this, but to that very point that you just made, I think in acting, the Meisner method, Meisner, I think I'm getting that name right, he talks about the idea of if the actor loves what he's doing or she's doing, then it becomes very obvious to the audience and they react to it as such.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, if there's no, in any art, if there's no element of joy in the creation of it, there's no element of play, even if you're writing a tragedy, that becomes obvious. I mean, the moment it becomes the drudgery of, and even the most talented of writers can end up producing something like the screenplay from a 1970s television program. It's just because if you're just producing for the sake of producing, but if the actual joy of creation there, and even a perverse willingness to force your sensibility on others at times, assuming your sensibility isn't disgusting. Again, we're working within limits here. It communicates itself. It gives life to what you're doing, and I think, early on, when I first started publishing, I'd occasionally get an editor who would say, "Well, and they always praise the." I mean, this would sound terribly arrogant, but there's a certain virtuosity in the early things that can be more playful than is necessarily healthy. But anyway, you always get it as, well, will our readers, wouldn't it be easier for the reader? And always, I mean, violently, militantly, I would, I don't give a damn about the reader. that sounds, but it's not. It's actually much more generous. It's much more generous in nature to assume that your readers don't need to be led along on a rope to the point you're making. Give them some credit for being able to discern the pattern, even if it's a complicated pattern.
That's very profound. Sticking a little bit with the question of creativity and your own sort of approach to writing, but also being as such, the sort of central motif in your book, of course, is your state of being between in a state of dream and wakefulness in this sort of liminal space. And I was hoping you could say a little bit about that. To what extent is the creative process itself somehow tapping, a good creative energy somehow comes from something of a liminal space? It's not.
I firmly believe it has to. I mean, not in every instance. If you're doing the work you're doing, say a dutiful report about tax law or something, But when you're being creative, no, I believe that you have to think yourself into that state or intuit yourself into that state actually for the work to flow, because I don't believe any sort of creativity is purely the achievement of the self by itself. I do believe in inspiration. I believe that there's a kind of communion, with a reality that the imagination opens onto beyond the boundaries of the self. There's a wonderful passage in the last volume of La Recherche du Temps Perdu when Proust is describing the final form of the Vinteuil Sonata. Have you read Proust? Okay. And this is sort of a lovely, wonderful running, almost sort of paratactic structural device through the 7 novels. Is there's this music teacher who's actually a composer, and he's working on this piece that in its early stages is pretty, but not necessarily. But in the course of the novels, it gains depth and majesty and nuances, and by the end, it emerges as this fully formed piece of music that the listener, the narrator of the novel, let's call him Marcel, hears as. And he becomes all at once aware that there's a kind of mediation going on here, because on the one hand, it's the work of a lifetime, but on the other hand, it's the work of someone who's trying to open himself up in a priestly way to allow some other reality to manifest itself through his creativity. And it's funny, Proust, not the most pious of men, although also naturally pious. There's a similar, someone else in Vladimir Nabokov, might as well pronounce his name the way he liked to pronounce it. But Nabokov, also, there's a wonderful passage, I can't remember, where he talks about his writing, and this is odd given his hostility to the institutional forms of religion, but he talked about his writing as a kind of priestly office, in which he didn't use the word sacrament, but in which he was clearly thinking in terms of this, or even like a kind of theurgy, in which something more than he was, and again, strange for him, because he was a man who liked to think of himself as in total control of his materials. He spoke of himself as God Almighty in his own worlds, in his books. But he admitted there, at least in that place, that there was something more than at least the small conscious self that he was. And I think, whoever, even if, whether you're great or mediocre, there are moments, when the creativity truly, when you realize that it's carrying you along, when you will realize it's carrying you along, you're not dragging it along. You've been caught up into something more than you anticipated being able to do. And I honestly believe that You know, that there are these places where our consciousness opens to, you know, greater scope of reality. And so, and that's a large degree what the book is about, isn't it? So,
thank you so much for that. Speaking of your book, of course, would you kindly sort of read an excerpt for us, please? Just because, I mean, it is a book at the end of the day, and really to appreciate for those of us, those people who haven't read it yet. I mean, it's incredibly beautiful, and anyway, we can talk more about it, and I want people to experience a little bit.
it's also a funny book. Don't leave that out. So.
Well, it's hilarious. I mean, I found myself literally laughing out loud throughout. Then, you know, finding myself also, and then a moments where I had to put it down to think about it's something else. Jim.
Well, we talked before that, especially since we had that nice long extended prelude to this conversation in which to decide these things. I think we agreed on one of the early passages, the one in which fairies come up for the final time. For those, I mean, unfamiliar with the book, there is a talking dog in it. Whether he would be heard as talking in the full light of day or not is an open question. But here's my dog Roland, who is really a philosopher, but you know, in a discreet and self-effacing way. Anyway, this occurs in the book at a point just before a long conversation on panpsychism and consciousness, as well as an extended masque played out in a glade by a troupe of actors. All right. Another moonlit night, now in early spring, and Roland and I out in the pleasant chill under a cloudless sky, walking along our accustomed woodland path. No crickets as yet, but considerable amounts of freshly sprouting greenery underfoot. We had no need to turn on our flashlights, so bright was the moon and the light pouring down on us. There had been rain earlier in the day, and the air had a rinsed, pluvial freshness about it, as well as aromas of new foliage and the faint, sharp sweetness of early blossoms. I did not recall having set out. As a rule, our walks together took place during the day, but apparently something had summoned us out after dark. All I could remember was a vague image at the edge of my mind of Roland sitting before me with his leash dangling from his jaws, and all I knew now was that we were well on our way toward the larger of the forest ponds. We'd already crossed the low wooden causeway spanning the shallow rivulet, and now the mouth of the clearing was visible ahead, a fan of moonlight lying across it like a curtain of shining blue satin. The peacefulness was so profound that I felt as if I were floating, as was so often the case for me. I could not be certain whether I was awake, or only partly awake, or walking in a lucid dream. I knew only that I had no desire for it to end any time soon. "How far shall we go?" I asked Roland aloud, merely in whimsy, and certainly expecting no response. But he did respond. "Only as far as the little lake," he said, without turning his head to look back at me. "It's a special night, and I have something planned." He paused beside a large but ordinary-looking oak and began sniffing with particular animation and even apparent relish at its base. "What is it?" I asked after several seconds of this. It was several more moments before he replied. He seemed to be concentrating on some especially delectable redolence still clinging to the tree's roots. Finally, he drew back his snout, closed his eyes, took a deep breath as if luxuriating in the moment, and murmured, "Exquisite, exquisite." "What?" I asked, genuinely fascinated. "What is it?" He looked back at me over his shoulder, and as difficult as it often is to make sense of canine facial expressions, I could see that he was wearing what could be only a smile of deep contentment. "Forgive me." "I almost passed right by it," he remarked. "At first I failed to notice. It was obscured by the musk of that irksome fox. I'm afraid he appears to have been dining on an elderly chipmunk. But then I caught a trace of it, sweeter, more elusive, more delicate, yet more durable." "What?" "The scent of fairies out for an evening traipse." This, I confess, rendered me temporarily at a loss for words. I looked down at the roots of the tree, searching for what I could not have said. Small phosphorescent footprints, perhaps, or a dainty ring of toadstools. "Fairies?" I finally whispered. "You can pick up the fragrance of fairies?" "Of course," he said. "If one can see them, why shouldn't one be able to nose them out? Why would the higher, more divine sense be less able to detect them than the lower is?" The lower, I began, but then I stopped, took a deep breath of my own and shook my head. To be honest, I've never seen any fairies either. Never? There was an audible note of incredulity in his voice. Are you sure? I shrugged haplessly. None that I recall, and I don't imagine I'd forget. My brother, my eldest brother, that is, did once, long ago, when he was a small child in Florida, looking out the window of a train that had briefly come to a standstill. Just the once? Asked Roland. As far as I know. He nodded thoughtfully. I imagine that there are some fairly exotic species of fairies down in Florida. Nature is so wild and indomitable there, and so menacing. Do fairies vary by clime? I asked. Of course, he said. They're nature spirits, after all. They wear the aspect of the ecology they personify, though, of course, they change over time as the landscape is altered or circumjacent human culture evolves. There's a kind of cultural cross-pollination between fairy kith and humankind. In general, for instance, European fairies have become considerably more refined and decorous over the millennia than what they once were. Most of them today tend to be very reluctant to engage in the sort of mischief they were once notorious for getting into. At most, they're likely to knock on doors in the dead of night and to abscond with some milk and cake, and they're frequently socialists now. Not all of them, of course, not in the Caucasus, for instance, but for the most part, they're good Europeans. How do you know? I started to say, but Roland took no notice. On the whole, of course, the fairies of the Americas have a wilder quality still than their old world cousins do. They're still, how to phrase it, rather more titanic than Olympian. Now my memories of those previous walks with Roland, when I thought I had imagined him uttering discernible words, came floating back to me. That was what I heard, I said. You've mentioned fairies to me before, I was sure. I'd imagined it. He merely shook his head, sniffed somewhat impatiently, and resumed walking, pulling me gently along behind him. Of course I have, he remarked, after a few seconds. There's so many of them about. And you can see them still constantly? He sighed. Not constantly, he replied. No one sees them constantly. They're secretive by nature, and mercurial, and very elusive. Sprightly, you might say. I see them often enough, though. You would too, if your mind weren't so well trained not to do so. Surely you know that the world we inhabit, the world we sense and see and believe we know by direct acquaintance, is as much a convention of shared consciousness as an objective field of sensations. It's a construction of the collective imagination, the collective metaphysical intentionality, as it were, of a given time, a spiritual epoch. I did not answer right away. Instead, I cast my gaze upward at the dark silhouettes, the treetops, some of their branches as yet only sparsely foliated, against the dark blue sky and gleaming stars. Was any of this really happening? It was also very tangible, so acutely immediate, so full of sounds and scents and shivers of vital reality that it felt impossible to doubt it. Well, I said at last, I don't know if I know it, strictly speaking, but I've long suspected as much, certainly. And you're right to have done so. He paused briefly, raising his nose to take in some passing fragrance. Then he continued on toward the clearing, now perhaps only 30 yards or so ahead. Your species, I fear, has lost so many crucial avenues of perception over the past several centuries that even things that were once quite conspicuous to you have become all but entirely invisible, except perhaps in rare and fugitive glimpses. It's not surprising if you've become wholly insensible to things that always required a certain spiritual tact to see clearly, or for any extended period. In times long past, the fairies and the spirits of nature and the gods showed themselves to your kind quite openly, and your kind was dependably able, for the most part, to catch at least a glimpse of their glory as it passed by. Even in more recent centuries, they were still apt to make an appearance or two to you at some time or another in your lives, maybe most often in childhood, but now... He shook his head and his voice dropped to a somewhat grimmer and more lugubrious register. But now you've filtered so much of it out. That's what the brain and nervous system are, after all, a filtration system, a way of reducing the totality of conscious communion to the manageable dimensions of particular, punctiliar, subjective psychologies. But now the filter has become practically opaque where certain aspects of reality are concerned. In the modern age, the age of the mechanical philosophy, you haven't much chance of seeing those those luminous dimensions of reality where fairies tend to flaunt themselves. Once the mechanistic method became a metaphysics and a habitual way of seeing the world, so much that's truly alive and beautiful and mysterious was lost to your kind. Living spirits, especially my people, fortunately, never succumb to these frightful materialist superstitions. So I don't have to work so hard to pierce the veil of the quotidian and to see the radiant figures that dance under the blazing moon in the courts of that other kingdom. I can stop there.
Thank you so much for that extract. So it certainly sounds in those excursions you have with Roland that the world you're entering there is a very enchanted one. And I think as you have just to go back to what you've just, the end of that passage which you've recited, this is a big theme throughout your work, that of enchantment and disenchantment, to use Weber's terms, but of course you're painting it in a very vivid way, applying it to the century we're in now. And I just want to go back to a short passage which you did read, and that was about how the world we inhabit, the world which we sense and see and believe we know by direct acquaintance, is as much a convention of shared consciousness as an objective field of sensations. It's a construction of the collective imagination and the collective metaphysical intentionality of a given time and culture and spiritual epoch. So throughout this book, and you allude to it there, you and Roland are examining some of the ways in which the modern Western imaginaire has shaped itself in light of this mechanistic worldview, and the nature of reality or of the cosmos, of how we perceive the world around us as either being separate from us and essentially silent and brute and without purpose as you get in this mechanistic universe, or as being just part and parcel of who we are, as speaking to us, as unfolding the divine plenitude. So how is it that we can procedurally regain this vital metaphysical connection with the cosmos? How would you suggest that we go about that and become more like Roland, I suppose you could say?
More like Roland. That we could all be more like Roland. Yes, but there's some things we shouldn't aspire to because the disappointment would be just too grave. You see, I don't know if it's one of those things that individuals have the capacity to do. I mean, I really do think that there are ways of seeing reality that are unfortunately a kind of destiny. They're kind of an historical destiny for us. The way we perceive things, the way we think about them, the sort of communion we're capable of having with them. But I think, the obvious routes of return, the obvious avenues of reconciliation with that reality are the same as they've ever been. The arts, religion, not in the dreary sense of conforming oneself simply to a certain canon of dogmas, but I mean in the ancient sense of religion as a certain virtue that is a certain habitus of the mind, a certain willingness to be open to the divine, to what it shows itself in nature. And in the arts, I mean, I think that for late modern people, the arts are an absolutely necessary avenue of return. At one time, for all human beings, this was simply the organic expression of our nature, right? Every culture produced poetry before it produced prose, produced highly abstract painted figures before it produced the ability to sketch out the blueprints of a city. The artistic impulse was like the capacity for dreaming vividly, something that was spontaneous, organic, inescapable, and necessary for us. Now it's a capacity we have to recover almost willfully. But I think there's a spiritual, there's a real moral tutelage in the arts, because one has to learn to surrender to another's vision, and a vision that conveys to us more than we can tell ourselves. In some ways, more so than because we especially again in the late modern world, religions have become rather positivistic systems of propositions and adherences that, and I think it's one of the reasons why fundamentalism is one of the particular psychopathologies of modern religion, is because it's a desperate attempt to recover a sense of the sacred, but in the terms of a kind of highly late modern positivist grammar of proposition, tenet, the way that you might adhere to the Constitution of the U.S. if you're an American, or the unwritten Constitution of the U.K. if you're one of the vanishing breed of true believers in the U.K. Long may she last until Scotland goes. but that's not the virtue. That's not the habit of mind, the habit of soul that religio once was, which was rather a capacity to be seized from without by what shows itself in us and beyond us. So I think again that the way back in for modern persons is to a very great degree necessarily an aesthetic discipline, learning to see with the eye of appreciation, surrender before you begin to encumber it with moral or doctrinal expectations. It's not surprising to me that the one area where atheism never seems to be able to get a foothold, for instance, is in the musical world. There's certainly been atheist composers, but they're actually a vanishingly small number. It's to take probably the best living British composer right now, Macmillan. Okay. All of his work is absolutely saturated in his faith and in sacred themes. And I don't think he'd be able to write music on any lesser theme than God, And the arts in general, even when they try to take leave of God, return again and again, like they're probing a wound, or a place where a tooth has been lost. Even people that you think of as, why would example, not actually my favorite American novelist in the 20th century, but a good example is Philip Roth. The bleakest possible materialist vision of reality, and yet obsessively he's returning to the theme of God because there is something about attempting to create which always makes one, if not open to, at least obsessively concerned with the creator of all things, with creation as such, with the mystery of the being of things as an act of creative intentionality. As I said, I mentioned Nabokov, in one sense a very religious man, in that he believed, he tried to believe in the immortality of the soul, of eternity. He believed in the communion of spiritual presences. He believed all sorts of things, even though he was hostile to all dogmatic religion. And you realize that the author of Lolita, or Pale Fire, you go into these and you find again and again secret intimations of a presence of an author beyond the author. And it's always fascinated me that in the world of the arts, atheism, you can have an atheist artist, but you can't have really, using atheists in the fullest sense, you can have an artist who has no sense of the transcendent as a real possibility in his own life or her own life, and yet you can't have an art from which the transcendent is absent and that doesn't invite one to turn towards transcendence.
You have these really powerful sort of turns of phrases throughout. One which comes to mind, and I've in my notes right now, is materialist savages. Right, so this is sort of turning the thing on its head, right? Turning the tables around. Can you speak a little bit about materialism and I mean, relatedly, another very central question that you grapple with is the problem of consciousness. Of course, from a purely mechanistic, materialist point of view, consciousness literally cannot be explained. I interviewed a very famous quantum physicist some months back who teaches at Brown, and we ended up entitling the conversation "The Physics's Problem of Consciousness." I mean, it literally cannot be sort of explained. So if you could speak a little bit to those questions, please.
Well, okay, those are two gigantic questions, right? So all right, just give me 6 or 7 hours here. Yeah. As for materialist savagery, I mean, look, every age has its own special evils, its own special barbarisms. You don't have to idealize the past to recognize the special evils of a mechanistic, of a world that really presumes as its tacit metaphysics, as its presupposed picture of reality, a mechanistic materialist model of reality. You really are in the age of what Heidegger, again, not a sterling moral exemplar, but nonetheless an often perceptive diagnostician of late modernity. We are in the age of technology, the age of the inframing, or what he calls the Gestell, in which nature, rather than being, the upwelling mystery of being, has become rather this dead realm of resources awaiting our exploitation. Technology is the ultimate realization of the control over fortuity, over reality, that's adumbrated from the first for Heidegger, in Platonism, in the sort of the, and for others like modern era of Heidegger, Peter as the axial age, the moment of the sort of the vertical transcendence beginning to chase away the intermediate levels of spirits and gods. Well, however you putting that genealogy to one side, nonetheless, what you can say is we've arrived at a point at which it became possible, and we saw this in the 20th century, that human nature itself could become a technology, the mechanistic. And I mean, you don't really have to make an argument about whether materialist savagery is a proper way of thinking when we saw genetic or eugenic pictures of humanity emerge as soon as it became possible to think of humankind as a technology that should be mastered and improved. And that improvement involved the destruction of supposedly defective models, which would mean those obviously racially not elect, or humanity becomes an economic technology. We saw that, in the worst excesses of communism in the 20th century, or at least totalitarianisms that called themselves communism, basing their remit to reinvent the human, to reinvent human society on its mastery of the technology of Homo economicus, right? Materialism of the most purely reductive kind, say what you like, make all the disclaimers you wish, is ultimately an invitation to trespass upon the inner precincts of the mystery of the human in a way that previous generations knew not to do. There was always that inviolable inner sanctuary that was the special home of God or the gods or the daimones and of the spirit, the self, the soul, that one could not touch. Humanity was not just a technology to be adjusted, rearranged, reconstructed. The moment that sense of an inviolable sanctity or an inaccessible divine temenos in the human person or in nature or in the created world or in even animals, the barbarism of the 17th century. Think of those Cartesians who were willing to torture and vivisect dogs because they had come up with a mechanistic picture of the body and a purely a disembodied notion of the soul and made the soul the unique possession of human beings. All sorts of atrocities, from cruelty to animals, destruction of the world at large as a standing reserve of neutral dead resources to be exploited, right up to the Holocaust, okay, and the gulags. That's an ideological, that's the consequence of a certain ideological and metaphysical revolution. The movement from the mystery of being to the mechanism of nature in the modern sense, physicalism. Now, again, you don't have to idealize the past. You don't have to say that everything before that, because that same sense of the sanctity and inviolability of the human person could be allied, and of the mystery of the gods or of God could be allied to fairly cynical authoritarian structures of power that exploited and abused and still do, in their own way. So, but as I say, every age, every epoch of the spirit, so to speak, has its own special evils, and I think the evils of an unguarded and dogmatically confident materialism, again, have just Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Now, as for consciousness, I in fact, that's the big theoretical treatise I'm writing now. I've got 2 works of fiction, actually 3 works of fiction coming to finish first, but one of them is a sequel to a children's book I wrote with my son a few years ago, which is a masterpiece. The Mystery of Castle Macgorilla. You should all buy it. Roland is in that one too, but the Book of Organized Consciousness is, I think it's more and more, as each philosophical project to come up with a plausible, logical, causal connection between first-person phenomenal, intentional mind and third-person electrochemical and mechanical events has failed, has magnificently collapsed under the burden of its own contradictions and warrantless presuppositions. And as sciences that mistake themselves for sciences of consciousness, which are actually just sciences of neurological correlation with cognitional states, have proved, as we could have predicted they must, impotent to give us any insight on this union of the first person and the third person. More and more, you've seen philosophy of mind among committed physicalists tend towards 2 extremes. One is panpsychism, which can be understood in a great many ways, but understood as a purely materialist system is based on a kind of fantastic notion of consciousness as a property attendant upon every physical symbol, like simple atoms onward, or even before, even at lower levels of reality than atoms, down to Planck scales, as just that there's a pathological, to use the Kantian language, a pathological side concomitant with the nomological side of nature. And that somehow, through cumulative complexity, this becomes greater structures of consciousness, or becomes consciousness as we think of it, as reflective. So the problem with that is again, that whereas I'm sympathetic to certain kinds of panpsychism of the non-materialist side, the materialist picture simply defers the problem to the Planck scale. You've still got this inexplicable union of the nomological and the pathological, as well as now an infinitely amplified combination problem of trying to understand how a composite effect, a composite consequence of physical states can lead to a simple state apprehension of consciousness. The other extreme, of course, is simply to deny that consciousness exists altogether. Total eliminativism, and say that what we call consciousness is just an inadequately, that's folk psychology, and what one day we'll be able to chase away talk of intention and choice and subjectivity and pathos and qualia by understanding first the chemical, biochemical, electrochemical level, and then understanding the physical laws underlying that, so that we could reconstruct the seeming phenomenon of consciousness from the level of basic particles upward. That's just stupid. I mean, I'm sorry, for 50 years, Daniel Dennett's been preaching this, and for 50 years, he's failed to make it even logically coherent, because he's always failing to argue the one thing that he's supposed to be explaining, which is the evident fact of first-person experience, is the one thing that he cannot accept, because as sophisticated as he and others like him are in their grasp of the sciences, they're still fixed in the mechanistic paradigm, the mechanistic metaphysics of the 17th century. And how was that metaphysics fashioned? It was from a method that excluded mental phenomena like intentionality, teleology, consciousness, and just put them in a different realm altogether, that of soul, and then ultimately tried to drag them back into the mechanistic picture, but without any means for doing so, because you've already it's already been expelled from nature. Not a problem, say, for an ancient Aristotelian, or a Platonist, for whom the structure of nature is already mind-like. It already has an intrinsic teleology. It already has a kind of pathos. In fact, there's quite a lot of panpsychism in the early Aristotle, So, yeah, I told you this was going to be a long answer, because you asked two. I think the sane conclusion to anyone who's really deeply immersed themselves in the absolute oceans of philosophical and scientific literature on this is that there is no way, plausibly, causally, of explaining consciousness in physicalist terms. That the eliminativist option is just an insult to our intelligence. So panpsychism is winning the day one way or the other, but as long as it's still framed in physicalist terms, it too is going to fail. Now, I also dislike the Cartesian model. I'm a pure idealist. I believe that the ground of all reality is consciousness, and that doesn't mean that there aren't physical body state, but whatever there are, whatever unions or disunions they are, body, soul, mind, or however it works, all of it is reducible to a more original unity, a sort of metaphysical monism of mind. And obviously, I think there's one preeminent mind in which, so to use the word with dangerous imprecision, that everything ultimately is an infinite act of thought.
Thank you for your insights there, and thank you also for those quite sobering comments on materialism and the consequences that it has on the environment. So I know you've already answered this, and the answer is very much, turning to art and other mediums such as that in terms of re-enchantment. But something which also has a role is the divine feminine, which I believe you talk about. So how would you say that our approach to this concept of the divine feminine, how can that contribute to perhaps remedying some of this materialist savagery, as you say? What role does that have?
I think that the sort of deep green critiques of a lot of religious tradition are well taken. That there is a sense in which the moment you start thinking, the more you start thinking of nature either purely as an artifact, or purely as a realm of conquest, or purely as a kingdom to be ruled over, you're obviously falling into certain paradigms traditionally associated with the masculine world of conquest, control, and all that. But at a deeper level, of course, it fundamentally dissembles the nature of life in the world, which is, we're not just thrown into the world in the sense that, we're punctiliar essences cast into an alien. We're born out of the world. We are sheltered. We are, nourished. We are, and so you start, the traditional images of the divine feminine again fall into the very traditional paradigms of motherhood and spousal love and all that. But at a deeper level is just the recognition that you're trying, you should try to learn the apophatic discipline of not confusing the divine for some jealous, controlling sovereign, whether you think of that as a controlling mother or controlling father figure. And, you know, one of the reasons that, say, like sophiology has this rich thematic depth to it in someone like Sergei Bulgakov late in his theology, is because, you know, he recognizes that that among other things, there's this tendency to exclude, and this is very much the burden, and part of the Western tradition, but not only the Western tradition. I mean, you'll find this in Asian traditions as well. To exclude one half of human experience, of human capacity, human nature, whether it's the feminine in woman or the feminine in all of us or whatever, and that in so doing you create this curiously bifurcated understanding of the relationship between God and his creatures, God and his creation, that is itself already premonitory of an ultimate nihilism. There's a curious way in which this, you know, again, I don't want to keep praising Heidegger because, you know, he was a Nazi. That goes on your permanent record. Whether, you know, I don't care what people say. At some point, he must have understood what he was doing. Nonetheless, kill the messenger. In this case, do kill the messenger, not necessarily the message. That sense of.
There's a lot of talk nowadays with Foucault's sort of terrible sort of abuse of children, and one as someone who's been heavily influenced by Foucault, I mean, whether the Panopticon and Madness of Civilization, one discipline and punish people, we cannot get away from thinking through Foucault, and yet this does weigh heavily on one's psyche. So, I mean, this is something we have to deal with.
Well, yeah, I don't know why it is that those who were the most acute in understanding that in continental thought that we had to undertake a genealogy of morals, and maybe it's because it's Nietzsche who sets the agenda from that period on. Although it needn't have been, you know, I mean, well before Nietzsche, Hamann, devout Christian, beatific, saintly, so in his criticism of Kant, had already pointed to the sort of the cultural contingencies and genealogical suppressed metaphysical and metaphorical genealogies in our ideas that should be mined again, you know. But I don't know what it is. Anyway, to unite your question to Esme's question, there is a history in the West that tends towards this nihilistic estrangement. First of, you get the God of absolute sovereign will and power, who's sort of a cartoon of a king on his throne with absolute privilege and potency. And then that becomes the model of the sovereign self, because the self becomes a mirror of the God who is, you know, most high, you know, so that the pure sovereign God of 16th and 17th century theology becomes also, you know, it becomes a reflection of the sovereign of the absolute sovereign of the emerging nation state. Then the self becomes an absolute sovereign for whom God becomes a rival, you know, this sort of petty, this jealous, this, you know. I don't know the degree to which talk about Sophia or the divine feminine has the power to disrupt that image, but I was certainly hoping it could do some serious work. I mean, make us realize that we're still thinking in terms of some, you know, let's just put it honestly, a male ego in relationship to a world that it wants to conquer. And, you know, not that women don't have those male egos, or not that men can't shed them. I just mean that if we're going with the sheer archetypal, the sheer imaginative, the sheer the way we draw on the fullness of human experience to depict God, depict creation. By the end of the 16th and 17th centuries, you've gotten to the point where God is a real, bit of a bastard. I mean, in the bad sense, a bad guy, just a tyrant, a sovereign, just pure predestining, voluntarist, absolute power exercising itself for the sake of power. And then that becomes the paradigm for what it is to be human, to be a sovereign individual self, to be free, is to be a little God. And it is noticeable that some of the best critics of this entire decadent phase in Western Christianity have been feminist theologians.
Thank you. So going back a few steps to your panpsychism, as you could call it, and we've actually just had a question in from Brian Harris, which is quite related to this. So I thought this was a good time to start bringing in some of the questions from people who are viewing. So he asks you, how does your endorsement of absolute idealism, where consciousness is all, so how does that square with your retrieval of realist metaphysics? And how are we to situate this vis-a-vis the traditional debates between realism and nominalism?
Sorry, go on.
This is the last part of the question was, do you see the realist-nominalist divide as germane also to our reception of Indian thought, whether Hindu or Buddhist?
Well, historically, all metaphysical realism is an idealism. I mean, nominalism is of its nature a retreat from a metaphysical picture of real forms and real essences, and so I'm not quite sure where the conflict would arise there. When I say I'm an idealist, I just mean that I believe that I'm willing at sort of the preliminary level of our understanding of consciousness to tolerate some versions of dualism, not the Cartesian, again, for reasons I've already enunciated, and also because I just think it's a crude picture. But I believe that's reducible. Every dualism has to subsist in a more original unity. There has to be a simpler, more parsimonious principle that allows the terms of the dualism to coexist. And to my mind, the only plausible, the only logically valid single principle is not going to be matter. It's not going to be the materialist understanding of matter. It is going to be an act of intentional thought. And I mean, in the encounter with Indian thought, I mean, at various times, all the issues that we're familiar with occurred and recurred with surprising regularity and a great deal of sophistication, often with greater sophistication than we can boast in the Western tradition. For instance, I would say to a very great degree, in a very real sense, there was no philosophy of consciousness in the Western world until the 19th century. Maybe parts of the 18th. There were theories of mind and body, how they relate. There were metaphysics of higher and lower functions, but there was no really deep phenomenological or other philosophy of conscious states, conscious processes, what's happening. But there was in India, in Buddhist thought, especially Yogacharan thought from a very early period, but also Madhyamaka. And then in again in Indian thought, in Vedantic, in both Advaita and Vishishtadvaita, also actually in Vaita too, because Madhava talks. So, I think that, I'm not the wrong way to understand a dialogue between West and East is between two complete systems first of all, there's no such thing as Hinduism, but there's also no such thing as Christianity or Western thought or Judeo-Christianity or Abraham. The degrees of variety, the fluidity, the ambiguity, within all of them, the variety of schools that in fact are opposed to one another quite often in some of the most fundamental issues. And that's true in India as well. Rather, it's better to situate ourselves in conversations that exist in both places. The debate between nominalism and realism, or qualified realism, or a kind of, or debates about the reality of an eternal basis of form or form only in say the conjuries or in the collections of Shamkya elements. That's what we should be doing. We should, at a very deep level, be engaging specific conversations as well as specific religious beliefs and practices within Indian traditions. There is no, I'm sure you both well know, there is no such thing as Hinduism. Or if there is, it's an invention of the 20th century, parasitic upon British and before that Muslim colonization of India, in which something was called Hindu, and so modern Hindu nationalism and orthodoxy, Hindutva, and all that is very much an ideological construct of the modern age that's basically borrowed from Western colonizers. And I think these questions of idealism and nominalism are very much part of the realm of engagement, but they're not an engagement from one tradition to the other. They're an engagement on controversies within each of the traditions that then can cast light upon one another when they're brought into a sort of integrated conversation.
To the question, I mean, you mentioned the point, talking about the Indic traditions, sort of that problematic umbrella term, Hinduism. And of course, the divine feminine is very, very, it's riven through the whole, which is kind of contradictory because at the same time or paradoxical, because there's a history of abuse of women in that culture very often. But
that's the thing is why I have to say this. It's never any better. That's the social reality is that in every culture, except maybe like these marginal groups that somehow escape the larger cultural logic, but in every culture, no matter how high the adoration or reverence of the feminine is, the condition of women is dismal, historically speaking. They are the oppressed of the oppressed, and so that's one of the reasons why I talk of the divine feminine. I'm always kind of curious. It's like, well, let's not confuse that for an actual commitment to social justice for women.
My intention wasn't to critique.
I know.
On divine feminine at all.
But you're right. You're absolutely right. That just as in Western culture, no matter how high in the scale of adoration the figure of Mary might ascend, that didn't materially alter the condition of women in most of Western history, except to a slight degree. I mean, you can show improvements and ameliorations in certain classes in certain times, as the moral language of Christianity in general did, where it had real beneficial effects on cultural evolution. But on the whole, there is a remarkable double consciousness when it comes to the cultic adoration, not just of a woman, but of some sort of elevated ideal of the feminine and such, and the actual treatment of women in the society.
Absolutely, and at the same time, I think your sort of focusing on the divine feminine is absolutely essential. And not only that, to my mind, some of these discussions that are happening now, and understandably so, these are not new discussions around the notion of toxic masculinity, and you have the sort of Jordan Petersonian types trying to re-empower men. And I know, and I don't want to focus on Peterson per se, but my sort of thoughts on a lot of this is in keeping with some of the things you've been suggesting, that what we have is this over focus on the sort of masculinized, archetypally speaking, notion of what it means to be, whether in a male body or a female body. And that's sort of what's been running the show for a very long time. But we have to reintegrate the feminine, and not some sort of airy-fairy sort of way. It's a sort of practical thing, and
just recognize the full dimensions of human personal experience.
Right, and the notion of embodiment, of course, is there's something of a turn, as it were, where one could sort of identify in sort of Christian Protestant theology, as far as, you know, the womanist turn, focusing more on the body and things like that. And I wonder to bring it.
Worry though. Again, why I'm always very hesitant about this is that you can fall back into these patterns in which the feminine is so associated with the, you know, the fleshly, the carnal, the uterine. Is that, you know, then the woman becomes a figure of that which is not rational, that which, you know, you fall back into the same patterns rather than saying, well, rationality actually, you know, has all sorts of different shapes, expressions, and maybe some, you could say, some seem more. You know, I mean, it's like, it seems to me like it's simply a fact of experience that women have better social intelligence than most men. Not of every case. I mean, you mean really socially stupid women and really socially perceptive men, but it just, you know, or the you know, but if you fall too much into these patterns, you know, you end up with, you know, the woman is body, and then what is man? He becomes spirit, mind, you know, and so how to negotiate that. This, on the one hand, you want to get away from the sort of cartoonish masculinism of the sovereign, the 17th century God, the sovereign, just proving how powerful he is by how many people he can damn to eternal torment for no reason other than that he can do it. But you know, you don't want, you know, just to sort of, without thinking about it, just then say, well, but associate woman with the home, the heart, you know, the steaming plate of food, a kiss on the forehead at bedtime. You know, you have to make sure that you don't in any way just say, well, the carnal feminine, the bodily feminine.
Well, I was actually going to make also a point through our friend Foucault, and I don't know how much of a friend he is anymore, but his sort of very important notion of the formation of the subject through these disciplinary mechanisms, and pointing to the very real embodied nature of our being, which, to my mind, the traditional religious so practices knew this as a matter of course, whether in Hinduism, broadly understood, Eastern Orthodoxy, the Islamic tradition, Buddhism, etc. So I wonder, to what extent do we need to be coming back, returning to, because either we're adopting consciously our sort of disciplinary, choosing our disciplinary practices out of, you know, a conscious act of choice, or they're being imposed on us by these broader sort of structures of power, and sometimes very insidiously and surreptitiously and malevolently as a result. I mean, we take for granted now we engage with one another through these screens, but what is it actually doing to our psyche? Anyway.
Well, we also, you know, to a very great degree, have learned to understand ourselves first and foremost as consumers, as, you know, boundless wellsprings of personal desire and always personally inflected, and that the desire in and of itself, with obviously a few egregious exceptions like what Foucault turned out to be guilty of, is its own justification, and also as in competition with one another. That the world, this is the great capitalist picture, that that it is natural for us to be competing for the greatest share of the resources available. You know, that is the modern self, right? It's isolated. It is a wellspring of pure acquisitive will before it is capable of sharing, you know, being generous. And, you know, it's an emergent, the self emerges first and foremost as a competitor for the limited resources of nature and society in a world that is first and foremost red in tooth and claw. I've already forgotten your question. I've become so excited by my own rhetoric. I find myself fascinating.
Well, no, well, but you, I mean, you are fascinating, and you can forget that once in a while. Once in a while, can you forget? But just the idea of the embodied practices of the
Well, yeah, right.
tradition.
Yeah, the thing about it's interesting because, of course, I've written on this before. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, talking about the spiritual body as opposed to the animal body or the psychical body, a body of psyche and pneuma. What's interesting is, I mean, the body is still body for Paul. I mean, he believes in spirit as a kind of element, really. In fact, this is common for late antiquity. You would think of it as kind of an ethereal or super ethereal sort of element that's also somehow the wind, or it's the subtle current in the wind, or it's an ichor, that a subtle essence in the optic nerve, the optic causeways. There's not the firm distinction between. There's not a Cartesian distinction. And often you have said that, well, Plato was a kind of Cartesian, for instance, Platonism, but that again is wrong because there's not a mechanical body in Plato. The body itself is a reflection of an eternal idea, naturally fitted to the expression of a spiritual presence, and it dies the moment that the spirit's not there. And the mechanical idea has it's not the Cartesian automaton, or not automaton, but the Cartesian puppet waiting for an immaterial puppet master somehow miraculously to take control of in the pineal gland. Embodiment, is for Paul. Obviously, he believes flesh and blood will pass away. I mean, people. I don't know. You can get an argument over this, but Paul's quite explicit about it. Flesh and blood can't inherit the kingdom of heaven, but the body remains. And you find this throughout, not, as you said, both East and West. I mean, the sense of the subtle body, the spiritual body, is not a rejection of embodiment. In fact, it's understood that community for finite spirits is an embodied reality, right? It is embodiment as such. But it's embodiment within a hierarchy of embodiment, right? An embodiment within a spiritual community, right? Which is itself the greater body of the protanthropos, or the the totus Christus in Christian thought, or Adam Kadmon's cosmic expression, and you have this, of course, in Islam as well. In Islam traditions, the original man, or the man from above, and that embodiment, and it's this nested embodiments within nature, within the world, within the greater body of the one human nature. And there again, in Greek, physis is not an abstraction in the way we use nature now, or really has that like natura originally, that sense of being also birth, of being a line of descent within a physis can mean literally your origin, your physical origin, your family, your people, your race, your whole human race. Disembodiment, the notion that we are abstract essences. In fact, you don't even find this in the supposedly Gnostic literature. There too, they're very firm idea of a true subtle body. That's very much, again, a modern phenomenon, isn't it? The notion that the self is so isolated from nature, from reality, is so pure in its absolute sovereign selfhood that it's not even really local. It's not, and it doesn't exist within this ecology of living selves, within this hierarchy of embodiment. It's a curious picture because it's completely contrary to every moment of actual experience, and yet in a very sense, it's even true in the psychoanalytic tradition. To a very great extent, we have no modern concept of the self that isn't this strangely abstracted remnant of what a real human being is.
and you sort of hearken repeatedly, and I think very importantly, to this sort of shamanic consciousness that you're experiencing, and how radically that differs from discussions these days, which follow logically, given the sort of genealogy, historical intellectual genealogy about, and you talk about these things, the idea of the transhumanist idea of ultimately downloading one's consciousness in these hardware. And you have a fascinating sort of thought experiment as what could be a very dystopian, scary video game idea, where people, which relates also to intelligence.
I'm afraid you're breaking up on me.
Oh dear, this is internet.
Yes. I think I know what he was getting at, though.
Yeah.
Sorry, my connection fell out there. Sorry.
There you go.
The internet's haunting me today. But before,
That's because it really is conscious. We're completely wrong. The internet is a conscious entity. See if your computer can pass the Turing test quickly. Could you?
Well, it sometimes convinces me of its sort of consciousness sometimes and human qualities. But what are we to do with these narratives of artificial AI and artificial superintelligence and this it has this powerful weight of historical force and moneyed interests and so on and so forth, and what do we do with that? I mean, just psychically, but also existentially, practically.
I once, I don't know if I should admit this, it was quite by accident. I had dinner with Peter Thiel, the PayPal billionaire who is very much interested in this preservation of the self in the form of an eternal algorithm or whatever. Because he also funds and thinks of himself as a Girardian and funds Girard conferences. And I was at a René Girard conference and I was invited to dinner. And I talked to him at the time, and I realized that there are those who think that consciousness could just be a software inhabiting functionally any kind of platform capable of hosting it. Now, there's a Cartesian dualism of its own. You find it in Dennett, in which the brain is a sort of rhyming. Oh well, we've lost Hassan again. I'll talk to you, Esme.
Oh, please do. Yeah.
The brain is sort of like the hardware, and consciousness is a software. I mean, I'm not sure what this would mean. Of course, it's a complete confusion of categories. Software, the algorithmic structure of software consists basically in notations, binary notations at the present state of computers, which mimic functions only in the minds of those who use the software. The same software that produces a correct answer when you use it as a calculator could just as well produce an incorrect answer if you programmed it that way. There's no intrinsic link between what it does and any active mentality, let alone any form of experience of third person phenomenal experience. And so of all the absurd, I mean, it's enchanting when we deal with computers. There is such a powerful technology there that seems to reflect our own wills and intentions in the form of another. You can ask your phone a question and it will sometimes even get the right answer, sometimes mishear you, and ask if you really want to go to a massage parlor, when you're asking to send a message to someone. This happened to me not long ago. I forgot to say text. I said send a message, and it tried to direct me to a massage. But putting that aside, I can't think of a more absurd confusion of categories. There is nothing that a computer does. There's nothing in it that even faintly resembles consciousness. There are only functions of utility that mirror our uses of it in the way that any other tool mirrors our uses of it. But because of the nature of that mirroring, we all become sort of Narcissus. We stare at the computer and adore ourselves and imagine that there's a world there that's waiting for us to enter in. And, you know, the story that Hassan was is that at one point in the book, Roland thinks of writing a science fiction story in which the algorithms of certain computers have become so sophisticated that they not only pass the Turing test, they succeed in convincing everyone that the computer itself is conscious. Then people begin downloading their minds into it actually there's a total affective void on the other side. There is no consciousness there, but no one knows this until they've all been downloaded, you know. And it's a silly science fiction idea, but it was I think in the book I say to Roland that it's worthy of Adolfo Bioy Casares. Do you know Bioy? I don't know how much Latin American fiction.
Well, I think it would make a perfect Black Mirror episode. I think they have something comparable, but
right. Well, this is a slightly higher level. Read The Invention of Morale, and you'll get the point I was making. It was the best novel. Bioy was a great friend of Jorge Luis Borges. Sorry, I don't mean to Castilianize his name. And The Invention of Morale is about what appears to be a community of real people, but it's nothing but empty projections left behind by a machine that's still running. And it's a brilliant little grim fantasy. I'm afraid Hassan just keeps winking in and out of existence.
Oh, no. So I was, thank you so much for that. It's fascinating. I mean, the relationship between technology and spirituality / lack of spirituality is absolutely fascinating, and is actually, not to digress, the subject of my dissertation at the moment, looking at witchcraft on TikTok and asking the question of
witchcraft.
Yeah, it's incredibly heavy. I mean, I completely underestimate how viral these things are. I think that the hashtag witchcraft has over 10 billion views. Obviously not individual people, because that's more than the world's population.
No, it's individual people. It's just that a lot of them are, you know, magical.
Well, yeah, but it's the repetitive nature of the app as well. You sort of just, things are constantly looping, which probably doesn't help. Nonetheless, it's a huge phenomenon and worth talking about. But however, there's a couple of questions which some people have sent in, and one of them is on the nature of quite comparative in its nature, talking about the Islamic tradition. So perhaps before we go into that, there was a more general question which Hassan and I wanted to ask, and that refers to something you say in your book about there can only be one path to the great, there cannot only be one path to the great mystery of God. So you explore in the book, or rather Roland does, the complexity of human attempts at understanding the divine. And in one place you remark to Roland, "You're a bit promiscuous with your syncretisms, aren't you?" To which he responds, "I certainly hope so." So, well, personally, would it be fair to say that you're promiscuously syncretistic? And more generally, do you think that this is an inevitable part of being a modern religious subject, especially as a scholar as well? Do you think that it's important to be, as you say, promiscuously syncretistic in the sense that there are more than one path to God? What are your thoughts on that?
Right. That's a quote from the Senator Symmachus, who said when the altar of it were, during the Christian period, during the rise, I mean, it was before Christianity was technically the imperial state religion, but it was the religion of the emperor. And the altar of victory was removed from the Roman Senate, and he protested. And Symmachus was not necessarily the most admirable of individuals, but it's a famous phrase. Yeah, I mean, I fully own up to being as promiscuous as I possibly can in my syncretisms. I've gotten to the age in life where I feel that if this scandalizes people, that I really don't care, because I'm more scandalized by a lack of curiosity and a lack of openness and an inability to recognize just the profundity, the beauty, and the eminent demand made upon us by other traditions. And even, and again, as I said, I don't believe that there's one Christianity that can be isolated, not even confessionally. I'm Orthodox, I'm Catholic. Well, yeah, huge varieties of thought and devotion there. But I think we are at a point where particularity becomes a different kind of scandal. It withers. When it becomes fierce and implacable and absolutely militantly opposed to any sort of miscegenation with other faiths, it withers into fundamentalism. It becomes a positivist creed that itself belies its own tradition. It becomes as much the enemy of faith as anything else. It's a bad parody of faith. But I do think, the scandal of particularity is, if you live in a global world where you've encountered these other traditions, and instead of finding them to be full of unintelligible, cruel, savage superstitions and bizarre perversions, you discover spiritual, metaphysical, artistic, devotional beauties and profundities that open up new ways in which you think even about your own tradition. I mean, the truth is that once you've really entered into an encounter with the other traditions, you don't have to embrace something outside. You don't even have to attempt a fusion. Whether you like it or not, willy-nilly, you're going to find your own understanding of your faith. What you thought you understood about it will have expanded, will have changed, will have become modified or qualified. And that's healthy, and it's inevitable. I don't think that there is a path back to cultures that are open to the transcendent, that does not acknowledge this reality, that God shows himself. God is visible in countless places, in countless forms. And I think instead, more and more, especially among educated young people, say, who are conscious of other cultures, the particularity begins to look like something arbitrary, and then like something cruel, and then like something contemptible. That's not to say that you can't be, I'm not saying that one has to become a sort of new age free agent among faiths. You can be a practicing Christian and still, but the notion that Christianity is just a sealed system of propositions and unique truths that are not found elsewhere, or that are not qualified and expanded in other places, is just it's incredible, but it's also destructive.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's quite a sensitive issue, and Hassan and myself, we went into quite a lot of depth in this in a recent discussion we had. But without further ado, there was a question which itself draws on quite a lot of different traditions, and it's I'm interested to see how you're going to answer this one. So this is from Ali from Twitter, and he says, I was wondering if you have come across any Muslim theologians in the Middle Ages or modern period who are universalist in the same way that Saint Gregory of Nyssa, Saint Isaac of Nineveh, Oregon, or yourself are. I know it's like he says. Oh, sorry, it's a little bit more. He says that he knows that some like to claim Mullah Sadra and Ibn Arabi were universalists, but as I'm sure you know, they only believed the torments of hell were temporary and not separation from God as such. I'm inclined to read some of the Ismaili Neoplatonists as universal reconciliationists, given their commitment to a Neoplatonic universal soul theology, i.e., universal soul can only be perfected if all of its traces are perfected. But unfortunately, most of them, these Ismaili Neoplatonists, turn out to be either annihilationists or infernalists. So essentially he asks, do you know of any universal reconciliationists in the Islamic tradition? And if not, why do you think this is the case?
You see, I'm wary of trespass in the sense that their old debates. I mean, I agree that it's tempting to see Ibn Arabi or Mullah Sadra as a universalist. There's certain formulations that point that way. And remember, it's not necessarily a strict either or. People say, well, what did Paul believe? Well, if you read Paul, it's clear that he believes that there's going to be a new age, and that those who are with Christ will enter into the new age, and everything else will be destroyed. And you could suppose from that Paul probably thinks he's, annihilated. He certainly had no concept of eternal hell. That's it's obviously an unknown idea to him. But then there are other formulations that are shockingly universalist in a way that goes beyond what would be possible to say if anyone were simply left out of the picture. And you come away from Paul, I think, if you really read him intelligently, with the notion that he was both a true universalist and somebody who was an annihilation, as the moments of reflection came and went. There are certainly material, Ismaili tradition especially, and material in, you can find phrases in Sharafuddin al-Neri, Ibn Arabi certainly. What was his name? Who was the murdered one? What was his name? You can tell I'm getting tired. The day is wearing on. And there's certainly suggestive passages in Mullah Sadra, But I don't know. I don't know if there's anyone that I would be confident in saying clearly you can point to him in the way you can point to Gregory of Nyssa or Isaac the Syrian, who's explicitly teaching the ultimate reconciliation of all creatures, with God. Why did I don't know. I mean, so much of the power, the hortatory power of the Quran is about making the choice before you reach the barzakh. The language of judgment is terrifying, inviting, beautiful within those terms, given that is the perhaps central paradigm, the understanding of our life in this world. Before reaching the barrier, the boundary of death, storing up works of righteousness that are pleasing to Allah, that it becomes much harder to articulate because the discrimination is so vital, so essential to the illumination that the faith offers. Less so in Christianity, because of course Christianity, what's central is integration into communion with God in Christ by the Spirit. Judgment becomes a frame there, a cosmic frame. It's not even understood the same way from age to age. How Paul understood the judgment, passage from this age to the next, or the sort of language of Jeremiah that Christ uses in the little apocalypse, or the way judgment is presented elsewhere. It's hazier. It's a lot. It's at times it can look like a mythic backdrop. At other times, like allegory. At other times, it can look as if it's can be read purely in preterist terms. I don't know if you heard in the distance, but Roland was objecting to me saying that this is where he and I disagree. I think the preterist reading is perfect. It's also in the Quran. I mean, the judgment, the day of judgment, the day when the throne of God draws near, is the constant challenge of faith to those who make the confession, La ilaha illallah, you know. So I think within just the spiritual sensibility, the visionary world that's presented in the Quran, it would be much more difficult to make the act of the divine discrimination a sort of secondary tier in one's thinking about the last things. Certainly rhetorically, you'd have to be very careful. If there, if there is much of a tradition of Muslim universalism, I think it would be more elliptical, more metaphorical, expressed more poetically, more judiciously, more secretly.
Thank you. So we've got another question from Saad. So he asks, our relations to others, in fact, constitute us as the persons that we are, and there is no such thing as a person in perfect isolation.
I recognize that from somewhere.
Well, he says this is a part, he actually just says following that. Sorry, this is a part of a point you make in your book that all shall be saved.
I think that's verbatim, but
he's drawing on that all shall be saved, and in this passage you're arguing essentially for universal salvation from the nature of finite personhood. And he asks, could you elaborate on the philosophical anthropology involved here? Could you also offer a few speculations on what becomes of identity or selfhood in the utterly changed aftermath of the afterlife?
He does realize that this is a streaming conversation that's not going to be very long. So I hope the questioner doesn't mind if I'm a bit telegraphic on this. In that part of the book, of course, I'm talking simply about persons as identities, which are constituted by a whole history of loves and associations and affinities, but also by those we're associated with from afar, or even just by and how we could possibly be the persons we are if our salvation involved separation from that identity, which it would have to do if the ultimate discrimination of the saved and the damned passes through the one body of humanity, but it also passes through each of us. Then it turns out we become distillations of ourselves, not ourselves. So there's that. If I were to give that a more if I'd written that a more philosophical, remember this book is dealing specifically with showing why the way that all shall be saved is constructed. It's to demonstrate the incoherence of any but a universalist perspective in Christianity. It's not necessarily meant to give an exhaustive picture of metaphysics. Like the first meditation is trying to show how divisions, for instance, distinctions between antecedent and consequent divine decrees falls apart at the eschatological horizon. Well, here the notion of the salvation of persons collapses the moment one actually has to take into account what a person is existentially. Now, metaphysically, I'd also say that since none of us is God, except by participation in, the divine presence, none of it, that essential structure of what it is to be a person, the depths of the undisclosed, which reveals itself in a logos, a manifest self, and comes to itself in spirit. This sounds like German idealism, but actually it's just pure Augustine or Gregory of Nyssa as well, or Maximus, or Nicholas of Cusa, and so on. None of us is, in that sense, complete in and of ourselves. Unlike God, that requires, since we are finite, changing, synthetic, in the proper sense, synthetic, we are, neither essence nor existence, but the two in dynamic union. That fullness of ourselves, who we are, coming to ourselves, is always mediated through and by otherness and others, in language, in community. We cannot come into full expression as human beings. You can't love, you can't think except by way of an exteriority that is also a responsive intentionality and self out there. It's just of the nature of human, divine personality, to use that word in a dangerously imprecise way, can be complete in itself and can have the fullness of relation and life in itself if it's infinite. We cannot. We're neither thinkers nor feelers nor creators nor selves, except in and through others. And by that relation we come to be. It just seems to me that that's obvious both as a metaphysical truth and as a phenomenologically verifiable experience. The notion that you could extract then any person from that larger, higher embodied hierarchy, as it were, of relations without fundamentally impoverishing or abridging, ultimately abolishing that person, I think, is self-evidently false. So, to quote that great Christian metaphysician, Abraham Lincoln, when he was asked who would be saved, it's either everyone or no one. But again, and that all shall be saved. I can add the metaphysical arguments, but especially this one about the very nature of consciousness and about there's a good Fichtean argument, by the way, prior to Hegel, about the way the self emerges, posits itself. Sorry, but I hate the air quotes, but I've been doing it constantly today. This is an eagle. This is a butterfly. Is that I think if you just think about it, you realize that you come to be in and by others. I mean, that you are not, even if there was some sort of purely individuated soul essence, it's a disembodied abstraction, a possibility of a person at most. A person is a history, and a history of community.
This has been truly amazing. If I can, we're very slowly, very very soon going to be wrapping up. And if my internet permits me, my internet's been giving me all sorts of trouble today, which God or the dog knows why. But you have this, again, a very sort of powerful and radical sort of phrase which you use, or Roland uses, and you convey to us this idea of militant compassion. And I wonder if militant compassion, is a militant compassion as sort of dogs embody and sort of being the as it were, the answer,
don't they? Yeah, they really do.
As being the sort of answer to so much of our problems today, but also is militant compassion perhaps in its ideal sense embodied in Buddhism, and how can we bring it into our own lives in not just a sort of theoretical sense that it sounds great, let's be compassionate, but relatedly, and my problem is I end up asking these very big questions because I think so many things can interconnect. You have this, you mentioned at one point that thinking about these sort of conservative Christianity that's sort of rearing its head in the States and has been for some time now, you feel that, or Roland does, I forget now, but the lines are sort of aren't clear, which is the point, that perhaps Christianity never really arrived in the States to begin with. So and it relates as far as compassion. How do we then bring that into our different traditions and beings?
Yeah. Well, obviously, in Buddhism, when it fully flowers in the Mahayana, metta and karuna, become so radical that ultimately the mere experience, the mere act of devotion to compassion by the bodhisattva effaces the difference between samsara and nirvana, so that, you know, samsara and nirvana are one if seen with the eyes of perfect compassion, karuna, mahakaruna, metta too. I think you find that also. I mean, if I, you know, let's say the Christian language of charity, and many other faiths as well. In Buddhism, it comes to the fore in people's understanding of it, because so much of again, why certain traditions seem to lay the emphasis here or there often starts with the question that's being answered. And the question that's being answered by compassion and the will for the liberation of all beings in Buddhism is one of a universal suffering, which is the result of an aboriginal involvement in pratitya samutpada, of the, you know, the interdependent field of co-origination from which one is trying to escape. In Christianity, charity has a somewhat more, you know, it has a quality of absolution in it as well, because it's charity towards those who are, you know, who in a sense are trapped in this world due to a burden of the past they can't shed, not because there's a metaphysical law of the generation of beings by way of tanha, but because there's a history of estrangement of God and creation, of humanity and creation from God. What I would say is this. I think it's always the best possible answer to every question about how should we then live. Because being merely, and the militant part is important, being merely kind, being merely compassionate, being merely forgiving can become just a personal therapy. And when it does that, it moderates itself necessarily, and we can all only do so much. I mean, it's natural, you know. There comes a breaking point for all of us. But when love or compassion is understood as actually a positive act to set people free, you know, and it's understood that the compassion is the sole motive. It really can, you know, it not just transform the self, but I mean, it can materially alter everything around us. You know, I'm quite certain, just as the absence, the absolute horror of having the Donald Trump presidency, you know, this absolutely despicable man, this oaf in office, was the conscious use of cruelty. There was spite, there was vindictiveness, there was like trying to get rid of the really rather unimpressive, by world standards, advances we'd made in health coverage in this country under Obama, just because he resented Obama, not because he had a philosophy. He's too stupid to have a philosophy, except, you know, that he wants to win. But what was really the most horrible thing of all was the conscious and calculated use of cruelty to achieve and to make points, stealing children from their parents, you know, crime against humanity for which he should be prosecuted, but never will be, was done to scare people away and to punish asylum seekers, whom we've always recognized at the southern border as having a legitimate claim to be heard in court. I mean, that's part of, I mean, I don't know if you've traveled much in America, but, you know, much of American culture at its richest and best is Latino culture, you know, or the fusion of Latino and Anglo and Black and Indian and Native American. You know, you go down the Rio Grande Valley, and it's by Indian I mean Indian India. I mean there's a lot of Southeast Asian. These are the richest parts of America, and there'd always been this sort of, sure, bigots and all that, but places of community like El Paso that are, basically open border cities, and this has always been part of the lifeblood of America. And to push through this racialist, this immigration policy, they were willing to torture children. Made it, all, and millions of people were still willing to vote for, millions of supposed Christians, because in America, the only real religion is America. Any other religion that comes here comes as an unwelcome irritant. Made you realize that, that compassion actually has to be a kind of militancy. If it relaxes, if it's not that, what I love about Buddhism again and about Christianity is it understands that that it is, setting the prisoners free, liberating, declaring this the acceptable year of the Lord, sending the raft of Dharma back across the water, whatever, taking the vow not to enter nirvana until all others enter before it, whatever it is. It has to be that. It can't simply be a kind of passive kindness, because then it turns out the monsters, will triumph. What you translate that into, what kind of action, I don't know. But the phrase you mentioned occurs in the book at a time that was a real time of despair for me, because I'd been ill for a while, and as I came out, Trump's not going to win. I was sure of that. I was in Indiana. I just knew he'd win the electoral votes here. I'm not an Indianan, so I can resent them for it. But I was sure it wouldn't happen. When it did happen, I have to admit, because the campaign was not subtle. This was a campaign based on hatred, resentment, cruelty. And the cruelty that followed was cruelty that had been promised. He was keeping his promises. He was going to be cruel. I realized that, so Roland is telling me the only solution is, be the tzaddik, who is the foundation of the world, of the olam. Be the bodhisattva, be the Christ. And somehow it just seemed right to me that a dog would tell me this, because this is the last thing I'll say. When I was a child, we had a dog named Laurie, who was entirely devoid of any aggressive instinct. She adopted everything: injured chipmunks, injured birds. We brought a little kitten home and she had been spayed at the at the SPCA before we ever brought her in. So she couldn't have puppies around. Instead, she adopted a cat, raised the cat. She was the most beatific creature I've ever known. She loved everything. She nurtured, she protected everything. She tried to nurse injured birds back to health. When her child, the cat, caught a bird, she would delicately take the bird away and protect the bird. So it just seemed to be right that a dog would be telling me this, because I honestly believe that they are spiritual emissaries to us, and that we should listen to them.
Well, this Professor Hart, this has been such a really remarkable honor and joy and pleasure, and really your book. For me, it's no exaggeration. And again, because it's inspired by Roland, this is Roland. You just happen to be writing on Roland's behalf. So basically, it's magical. Did
you like the heroic couplets of Uncle Aloysius's Melancholy?
Could we close with some of that, maybe?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I hope your listeners understand. Great Uncle Aloysius is a fictional character, but a poet. But one of his projects. I'll just read the opening lines. He writes one long poem in heroic couplets called "Melancholy," a prelude to what was supposed to be a long work. I hope that both the whimsy and the grace of these bits come through. But anyway, all right. The lambent sapphire of the sky of day in trembling streams has melted quite away. The west now dons crepuscular attire and wraps himself in gold and crimson fire. The chaste moon through the turquoise twilight pours her pearl-pale light upon our lustrous shores, and by her glassy essence opaline makes strand and surf with iridescent shine, and silver stars, cold fair and wanly bright, are scattered on the sable cope of night. Here where eternal order marries time, the sky is beautiful, the sea sublime. On high the primum mobile rotates, in my great clock the moment pendulates, and downward through the heavens' ethers flows sidereal magics guiding earth below. It was actually, let me see, what is? I think I'll stop there because I actually could just go on and on because because it was fun to write. That's, you should have mentioned there are actually 3 characters in the book: me, Roland, and great uncle Aloysius, the deceased poet whose family member whose poems my dog is editing for I wish I actually had a great uncle Aloysius because by the end of writing the book I'd gotten so fond of the old man. So.
Well, God bless you, Professor Hart, and God
Thank
bless
you. God bless
and everyone listening. And may we have more Rolands in the world. May we have more Dr. Harts in the world, and people who can bring love and light and sort of radical compassion, not only radical, but militant compassion to the world. We really thank you, truly. God bless you.
Very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I enjoyed this.
Thank you.